So those things make them challenging to manage, challenging species for the ministry to manage. More complicated in many ways is just the massive range over which black bears range here. And so this figure on the left here shows Ontario's main forest types. And sorry, I'm just looking this way. I know folks on the online probably can't see as well when I do this. Can folks online see will they be able to see the cursor there when I move it around? Or okay, great. So this figure on the left just shows Ontario's main forest types. And then on the right here shows generally the range of black bears in the province. These different colors are black bear ecological zones and just sort of dictate how the density of black bears based sort of on broad productivity types for these forests. So as Phil mentioned in his introduction, black bears exist pretty much across all of these forest types, except for the pure deciduous forest down here in the far southwest, where obviously much of that has been degraded and fragmented and is heavily populated. So we have bears oftentimes coming into the GTA and then all the way up to the coast of Hudson Bay and James Bay. So they exist over a huge gradient of productivity, of food types, of people, and of different stressors. Okay, so just that was a bit of background just on their ecology. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now about how the Ministry of Natural Resources in Ontario goes about actually managing black bears. And there's three primary ways in which this is done. These first two shown on the top are a bit more of our sort of secondary way of managing. So we often manage conflicts between people and bears by trapping them and moving them places. We passively manage black bear habitat through timber harvest. So timber harvest has significant influence on forest productivity and on black bear populations. But the main way that we manage black bears and main way we manage many species in the province is through harvest and through trying to manage how much harvest there is of the species. So how do we do that? So bear harvest in Ontario, just a bit of background here. So we have what's called an open resident harvest in Ontario. Any Ontario resident can go out and buy a bear tag and try to shoot a bear. We have no cap on that. There's only one tag allowed per resident, but every resident, theoretically, we could sell 15 million or however many million tags in the province. We have around 22,000 hunters annually, resident hunters. And from this number of hunters, we harvest around 3,300 bears. We also have a pretty significant non-resident harvest. So these are folks from outside of Ontario that come in and pay an outfitter to hunt bears. And we have about 3,900 non-resident hunters annually, and they harvest at a much higher rate than resident hunters. And so they take about 2/3 of our resident hunters take, but are about 10% of the number. All right, so we have that significant harvest of bears in Ontario, and I mentioned we don't really have a cap on the resident harvest itself. So how do we actually go about trying to limit that? So whenever we do harvest management, wildlife management, it's mainly about trying to make sure we're not harvesting too many animals from a specific area. So how do we do this? So number one is we restrict outfitter tags. So we try to we give fewer or more outfitter tags depending on what we want for a specific population. Some places we give out second resident tags, so residents can actually harvest 2 bears, and we limit that or open it up depending on where the area is. We also allocate vacant BMAs. These are bear management areas, and they're places that outfitters can go to have their clients come and try to hunt for bears. And so we will either allocate or not those ones that are vacant, and then we also can conduct restrictions on season lengths. Okay, getting to the more interesting stuff in a couple minutes here. Just need to give some background before we talk about why we're doing the work we did. All right, so how do we make decisions? So just talked a little bit there about how we manage harvest in Ontario. So how do we make these decisions? And this is really where things get more involved around where the research we've done over the last 7 or so years. Up until 2017, we informed sort of these harvest management decisions based on 3 criteria that you see down here in the bottom left. So one was just the total number of bears harvested per area. And this figure on the right here just shows the number of bears or the density of bear harvest that we permit or we desired in these different areas. You can see much higher harvests allowed in the south around Algonquin Provincial Park. And then this gets much lower as we go north. And then we also tried to limit the number of females, or we inform these decisions based on thresholds around numbers of females in the harvest and the number of adult females. And the reason for this is for any large mammal species, the number of reproductive females is really the primary driver of how populations go up and down. If We can have a very high harvest of males. As long as there's enough females to produce cubs, we can sustain high populations. And these are informed by a number of different data streams that we get from the province, get provincially. So this is based on research projects. These top two figures are just pictures of research project things that we do. And then also by our monitoring programs, food monitoring, and then conflict and harvest monitoring. Okay, so that's how we have tried to manage black bears in the province from the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s into around 2010. And this was going really well up until about the last 7 or so years. So this figure just shows the number of hunters on the left, the estimated harvest that those hunters took on the right. And this time period is sort of this bit of a stable time period over which we have a relatively consistent number of hunters. You know, harvest bounced up year to year. That happens with black bears because they're easier to harvest in years where there's less food available on the landscape. We had a pretty consistent number of hunters from the 80s into the early 2010s. And so that management system, that way of monitoring black bears worked quite well. However, starting in 2010, the number of resident hunters started to skyrocket and essentially doubled more or less in about a 7-year period. So you can see, looking in about 2016 here, this is the number of harvested bears. We harvested our all-time highest number of black bears in the province in 2017 or 2016. And it looked like it was going to continue to go up. Now, since then, this has actually come down quite a bit since that time, but the number of hunters, especially the number of resident hunters, has stayed quite high. And so this introduced a lot of concerns in the province about what this meant for black bear hunters. As I said before, or black bear population, sorry. As I said before, we have no real limit on the number of resident black bear tags that can be sold. And so if these numbers of residents was going up and up, there was concerns about the population. We also had a number of other sorts of indicators of how we assess populations that were suggesting to us that harvest was maybe too high. So this figure here shows some of these assessments that we conduct to determine if harvest is sustainable. And these polygons here are wildlife management units. So that's the area that we manage harvest over in the province. And anything that's in red or black indicates that we were tipping over these thresholds of harvest sustainability over the last 20 or so years leading up to 2017. You can see, particularly in areas in southern Ontario, there was some indication that we were heavily over-harvesting some populations. On top of this, we had some areas of the province that were real sort of conundrums for management. So this is a wildlife management unit just to the southeast of Algonquin Provincial Park. So this is Wildlife Management Unit 54. And this figure on the right shows sort of our harvest rate for that population. So this is based off of those figures I showed earlier, where our sustainable harvest rate would be, down here around 4, 5, 6%. And we were estimating that we were actually taking five times the population size of bears in that area every year. Obviously, that's not possible. You can't harvest more than there is five times as many bears as there are every single year. But there obviously was something potentially going wrong in this area as well that we needed to assess. Okay, so just to sum up before I talk about some of the actual work that we did and hopefully get a little bit more interesting information. So around 2017, we were faced with a lot of challenges for sustainable management. We had increasing black bear hunter numbers, especially residents where there was no limit. We had lots of indicators suggesting our harvest was unsustainable. And we also had some research that was limited geographically, the research that we used to inform population management and inform how quickly bear populations can grow and so how much harvest they can take. Those were limited geographically. And we had population estimates for the province that were becoming outdated. You also may remember there was a pilot spring black bear hunt that was introduced in 2014. And that was at the time in the middle of its run in 2017. Okay, so moving on then to try to talk a bit more about how we addressed these issues and how we tried to understand whether the population was still doing well and whether our harvest was viable or not. So, right, so I realized I missed a slide here, but so what we did was to go about trying to count how many black bears there were in Ontario to try to compare this to past estimates and see if these populations were healthy or not. So this sounds simple, but as I just mentioned, we have black bears that range over areas all the way from the GTA to the Hudson Bay Lowlands. This is over 1 million square kilometers, and it's very challenging to count animals over that large of an area. Added to that, black bears, unlike things like moose and deer, go to sleep in the winter, so we can't count them during the times when leaves are off trees, and they're obviously very cryptic, and so they're challenging to identify. We can't see them from the air, can't fly and do a bunch of surveys like we do with moose. And they are a species that doesn't want to be seen, right? We see them sometimes, but in general, they want to be in places where people are not, or if they're in places where people are, they want to be away from those people. So how do we count a species that doesn't want us to see them? And the main thing we do is we actually use DNA, and I'll talk a bit more about how we do this. So instead of trying to actually see the bears, we try to collect DNA from individual animals and count them through their DNA. So we do this, I'll talk a bit about the specifics of how we do this, but we go about doing this by establishing large networks of these baited barbed wire corrals across the province. And so this is just a bit of a cartoon illustration here. We go out to sort of secondary roads and trails throughout the province, and we set up these corrals. These corrals consist of about a 50 centimeter high strand of barbed wire that we place around trees. We go into the middle of that sort of area that we encircle with barbed wire. We hang 3 cans of sardines from a central tree that's in that area. And what the idea behind this is, hopefully this video runs here. I'll show you what we hope to have happen here. So this bear's already actually come into the corral. So he was attracted to the sardines, came in and checked them out, and now he's on his way out. See, he or she walks over the barbed wire and leaves a bit of hair on the strand right there. And you can see, I'll use my pointer here, bit of hair left right there. Yeah, so we go out, the bear does that. Hopefully many bears come and visit the area, and we set these networks out. So there's many of these corrals. We then come out into the field, walk up, pick up that piece of hair off the barb. We then send it to the lab here at Trent University, and we do what's called a genetic analysis of genotyping. And essentially what this is we run it through a whole bunch of different lab procedures to get a genetic fingerprint for each individual bear. So each individual bear, we can actually identify who it is, what its sex is, and who that actual animal is from the DNA that we get out of its hair. So there in each strand of hair at the root, as long as we get the roots, there's lots of DNA in those roots, and we can tell who the animal is. So we can go out and do that and count and identify and count the number of bears we get at these different areas. So the way we do this is we go out, we set up these lines, or these trap lines, we call them, along these roads and trails in the province. First week we go out, we put 3 cans of sardines, we wait a week, we come and take all the hair off all the barbs, we put more sardines out, and then come back and do that 5 weeks in a row. So every week for 5 weeks, we go out, there we go. We go out and we collect the hair off these barbs and try and send them to our lab. We get over around 20,000 samples every year that we send to the lab. They process them, tell us who each bear was at each one of these traps. And what this does, and I'll do I promise just a tiny bit of math for this talk, but what this does is produce these things called capture histories. And this is something that's been used for decades in wildlife management, these capture histories, to identify the number of animals that are in an area. And essentially it looks like this. Each one of these traps is shown here, or sorry, this would be a capture history for one trap. So this is just, cartoon data, but what this would say here is that bear A was not caught. So we have a 0 here. We didn't see it. It didn't leave any hair at that trap in week 1 or week 2, but then on week 3, it showed up. It walked into the corral, left us a sample, and then did not in week 4, and then did again in week 5. We use that information to do what's called capture mark recapture. And the idea behind this was developed for small mammals and mammals or animals that you can catch physically. And what you would do here is you go out, you set a bunch of these traps out, and on night 1, say that you caught 50 animals, 50 mice. You'd mark them with that little Sharpie that the person has in their hand there and release them. They go back out. You set your traps again, and then night 2, you catch 60 more animals. 30 of those are marked, 30 unmarked. And what you could do is you use that ratio of the number that are marked versus unmarked to guess how many you missed. And so in this case, night number 2, our ratio of marked to unmarked was 1 to 1, right? We had 30 marked, 30 unmarked. So we also know then that before night 2, we had 50 that were marked. And so that means we missed 50, right? So we can get an estimate of 100 animals. And so it's just general, just math based on a bunch of assumptions to produce an estimate of 100 animals. So it gets a little more complicated though, when we're talking about animals like bears that range over a very vast area, right? Some bears can move, hundreds of kilometers in a season. So to get at this, this presents some issues because it makes us question, all right, if we have 100 bears around this trap line, around these roads, what area did they come from, right? Is it 100 bears that were in this area, or was it 100 bears that were in this area? And that's very challenging if we want to be able to estimate how many bears are in the whole province. We need to know the area that they were ranging over. So this is the last bit of any of the methods or the math that we use. So what we do then to get at this is to actually use the movements of the different animals to get at how far of an area they're ranging over. And so we use the different distribution of the traps to tell us this. This is actually real data, real genetic data from one of our trap lines in northwestern Ontario. Each of these X's represents one of those barbed wire corrals. And all these colored dots and lines are from different individual animals. So the blue dots and lines are from one bear, the purple boxes and lines are from another bear, and you see female bears over here and male bears on the right. You see male bears move much more across this area than the female bears. But you can also see, this is the general area where this, pink square bear has spent its time. And we can use that information to say, okay, female bears are ranging over this area and get an estimate of the density of bears in this area, which can then be extrapolated out to areas that we didn't sample in the province. So, okay, how do we scale up from this to getting the estimate of the number of bears in the entire province? Well, we go out and we lay these networks of traps around as much of the province as we possibly can. And so those black lines indicate each one of those black lines is a network of 40 of these corrals placed in different parts of the province. And so you can see we sampled all the way from southern Ontario up into the pretty far north into the boreal forest, though obviously it gets very inaccessible once we get beyond farther north in Ontario and into the Hudson Bay Lowlands. And this is what we saw. And so this is the results of each one of these trap lines. So this shows at each one of these areas how many bears or the density of bears that was in and around those roads. Red would be less than 10 bears per 100 square kilometers, which is pretty low. So that'd be 1 bear per 10 kilometers, pretty low density of bears. And then orange is a bit more, yellow a bit more. The brighter yellow, I guess actually that's more of a green. It doesn't really show up great on the projected screen. But then darker blue down here in southern Ontario, much higher densities of bears, 1 bear per about every 3 kilometers or so. And then using some statistical methods, we can actually kind of scale this up to get an extrapolated density within these broader management areas. And so again, this just shows the average number of bears per 100 square kilometers in each of these larger management zones. And these lines, these little squiggly lines represent the boundaries of our forest types. So here, this is the boreal forest in the middle. And in the southern part here, we have our Great Lakes St. Lawrence or mixed deciduous forest. And we do have a bit of that also in northwestern Ontario. A couple things I think are very interesting about this map is that we get consistently higher densities of bears in areas with more productivity, right? The boreal forest is low productivity. There's not as many fruiting species, not as many hard mast species like acorns or like oak. And so we get less food for bears, lower densities of bears. Areas in the south, much longer growing seasons, much more, many more species that bears can thrive off of, and we get pretty high densities. And actually, this area here near Georgian Bay, about 50 bears per 100 square kilometers. That's about 1 bear every 2 kilometers or so. And so it's quite high densities of bears. And yeah, like I said, so high densities in the south and densities in some areas, however. So back to some of our early sort of impetus for this work, understanding if we were over harvesting or potentially impacting the bear population. You can see some of these areas where numbers are quite low. This isn't showing up quite that well, but this is 9 bears per 100 square kilometers around Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie, 13 bears here for this area, which is right on the boundary of the forest types. Those are quite low densities. Likewise, over here near Thunder Bay, you can see again, compared to the other areas that are nearby, much lower, close to half the number of bears in these areas around Thunder Bay as we see a bit further west. And the productivity is very similar in those areas, so likely this is related to human-caused mortality. I'll just briefly touch, before moving on to a couple other research projects that are related to this stuff, just briefly touch about Southern Ontario and the Peterborough area in particular. I know obviously interest around the province, but are the Peterborough field naturalists, so figure you're interested in what the bear populations are doing around here. And quite interestingly, we actually don't get enough data from the bears, from the trap lines that we have around Peterborough and the farther southern parts of Bear Range to even estimate densities. And so you can see we have a couple lines here, we're about in this area, and a few other lines in the south where we don't actually have enough data to be able to estimate the densities. Reason for this, very fragmented habitat, lots of farmland, harder to find places to trap for bears. But we also see throughout Southern Ontario where there's more people, the bears are very wary. We don't get as many bears coming back to these barbed wire corrals as we do in the north. So areas where there are fewer people, bears come back more frequently. It gives us more data to be able to better estimate their densities. Doesn't happen as much in the south. However, you can see, we're close by. There are some of these trap lines that are quite high density. So there are bears in this area, obviously, but probably at lower densities and much more secretive and wary of people than they would be a bit further north. Okay, I'm going to talk now just about a few other projects that working with some faculty at Trent and some graduate students. We use the data that we collected as part of this large-scale research monitoring program to answer some questions about black bear ecology, biology, and some of their management. So the first of these was a master's student named Evan Kapsala that worked with me and Chris Kyle up at Trent. And he used the data that we collected as part of this project to look at dispersal of bears. And so I mentioned before, we get genetic information from each of those hairs that we collect. And we can use that genetic information to understand how related bears are in different areas. And so each one of these little trap lines, we can say, okay, most of the bears are either highly related to one another, and that's based off their genetics, or they're not related to one another. And then we can use that information to understand how much immigration or emigration there is into an area. If an area has lots of highly related individuals, there's not much immigration into that area. If they're very unrelated individuals, they're very likely having lots of immigration coming in. So Evan did this for his master's project. He looked at the genetics and the relatedness among bears across all of those trap lines that I mentioned. And the results of that are shown here. Areas in blue, we have high immigration, high numbers of bears moving into those areas. And areas in green would be places where lots of bears are moving out of those areas into the blue areas. And you can see this huge area in central part of Ontario, particularly overlapping with some of those places that we indicated were sort of low density. So we have the Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie area here, lots of influx of bears into that area. And then again, around Thunder Bay, lots of influx from the surrounding areas of bears into that area. And that would be likely related to high harvest or high human caused mortality, creating sort of sinks where bears will then come in from areas around there to fill those back in. Okay, and then just the last couple things I'll talk about relate to how we're using this data with one of our other major monitoring programs. And I think this is some pretty interesting stuff that we can learn from all of this. So every year when hunters go out and harvest bears, we ask them to take out one of the harvested bear's teeth and send them to us. And I'll tell you why we do this, but you just see a picture of this here. Bears have these vestigial premolars, so they're actually teeth that they don't use for anything. And we can get a lot of really interesting things from this. So first off, what we can do, mammals, all mammals, you, me, any other mammal, puts on growth layers on their teeth each year. So our teeth are constantly actually having cementum deposited upon them. Black bears, because they hibernate and they really slow down their metabolism, they get these extra dark layers of cementum that are deposited more slowly. So this area here, this is a tooth of a black bear. These light areas would be the growing season. Black bears are putting on tooth growth on their teeth. That growth and how they deposit growth onto those teeth slows down when their metabolism slows down. And it makes these dark lines where there's lots of cementum deposited in smaller areas. So what we can do is when a black bear is harvested, or even if we take a tooth out during a research project of a live bear, we can go in, we can actually use a saw to cut into the tooth and then stain it and look under a microscope. And just like a tree ring, well, just like the tree rings, count the age of that bear. So this bear you can see has 12 of these dark lines. So this is a 12-year-old bear. One other thing we can get from this Because lactation for female bears, when they have cubs and they're lactating and nursing them, is extremely costly energetically, female bears also will put on very small layers of this light cementum during years where they have cubs. So they're not having as much nutrition to put into their own growth. And so the tooth growth slows down. And we can actually identify when these bears reproduced. So this one here, that's between age 6 and 7, had cubs, and between age 8 and 9 had cubs. So we can tell quite a bit from these teeth. Also, the hunters, when they take the tooth out of a bear's skull, oftentimes there's blood or gum left over, and we can use that tissue to also get DNA from the bear. So we get all this great information from these submitted teeth, and we can answer lots of interesting questions from them. So the first is that was obvious to us is we can compare the genotypes of these bears, the genetics, to the bears we caught as part of our hair sampling, and we can identify how many of those animals were then harvested. So over the last 7 years, what we've seen is that of the 5,000 or so bears that we caught on those trap lines with the hair snares, 311 were harvested and then had their teeth submitted. This is 6.4%. So that would suggest that at least 6.5% of Ontario's bears are being harvested each year, or over this time period, so not each year. So that's a relatively high, and that's also a significant underestimate because we don't receive all the teeth from all hunters. We also could look at the movement of bears. And so say, for example, we had a bear that we identified originally on this trap line. We can then look at where it was killed and where it was harvested. And about a quarter of these bears moved from where they were trapped on the trap lines to the place that they were harvested in a different wildlife management unit. So we can start to build information on where these bears are getting harvested from to support some of that information on dispersal. And then I'll just skip over this slide because I don't too much information, but one of the other things we can do from this, and I'll just go back to this one here. For female bears, because we can identify when they reproduce, we also can look at the age that they first reproduced at. So in wildlife biology, the age at first reproduction is a really critical piece of information that tells us how productive populations are. So if you think about this for a long-lived species, they may reproduce, this one, for example, reproduced twice. The earlier you reproduce, the more offspring they can have. And so if a species or a population has offspring earlier, they're more productive, likely are growing more quickly than other populations. So I had an undergraduate student, Noah Whiteman, who used the teeth information and related it to environmental factors across the province and identified the age at first reproduction for bears across Ontario. And you can see here some of the results of Noah's thesis. These redder colors are younger age at first reproduction. So again, down here in the south, and these kind of colder bluer colors are older age at first reproduction. So some things that happen here, we see that in Ontario, the average black bear reproduces at around 5 years of age. And that's a year or so, maybe even 2 years older than we see in other jurisdictions. And that's likely due to the fact that we're just further north than most other places where they have this information, which tend to be in the US. We also see earlier reproduction down here in the mixed forest where we saw higher densities of black bears, higher productivity as we would expect. And Noah also found that years where we have food failures or years where there was really good food relates heavily to when bears reproduce. So if there's a food failure, bears don't reproduce. If there's lots of good food, they will reproduce. A little bit troubling, one thing we saw is that most of the bears that we had, most of the female bears, had never actually produced a litter. So 53% of the bears were harvested before they ever even reproduced. And so they were harvested before that 5 years of age, which is a little bit worrisome that most of the bears are harvested before they have a chance to reproduce. So just one last thing, and then I'll wrap up. I know that there was an interest in saving some time for questions. So I'll just talk about one last thing I think is really interesting that we're currently working on with this information. So you may have heard of this thing recently in the news called epigenetic aging. And the idea behind this is that our DNA changes over time in a specific way. So the actual DNA itself doesn't change, but we have this thing called methylation, where methyl groups will attach to your DNA and turn off or on different parts of that gene, and it'll make make your body produce or not produce different proteins. And all mammals have a consistent pattern in which parts of your DNA turn off or on as you age. And so we can actually predict age from your DNA. Some animals or some individuals, as shown in this figure from a paper, some individuals will age more quickly than their chronological age, while others will age more slowly. we could use this information that we've gained from black bears. So we have teeth, we have DNA, we can actually predict black bear age from their genetics as well. So what this is a figure here. We went and used some of these methods that have been used over the last number of years in humans to combine our teeth information with our DNA and actually estimate black bear age based only on their DNA. And so this figure here, just shows the relationship between our age from our teeth and our age from bear DNA on the y-axis here. And we can see a very strong relationship between these DNA methylation markers and the actual age of bears. And we could use this information to try to estimate age structure of black bears across the province. Okay, my final slide here is just to sort of talk about where things are going in the future with Ontario and sort of black bear monitoring and population dynamics. So just presented about lots of these different pieces. We have these research projects. We've established sort of densities of black bears across the province. But we've got these monitoring programs that we'll consistently use to inform us about what's going on now into the future. So we've got a great baseline of information for black bear density and can use that to understand in the future how harvest management, how climate change changes those numbers across the province, and how we might be able to influence those through the management programs that we have. And with that, happy to answer any questions. And I have also, if people are interested, some more videos of bears at those hare corrals. Yeah.
My question would be, how do bear experts ethically support a spring bear hunt? Because you've got the females have been, dealing with the cub, not feeding. The female comes out of hibernation. She's starving. She's walking through a denuded forest because it's a spring, looking for food. And now you've got hunters with a 30-06 and an 8-power Weaver scope shooting over hundreds of yards, killing a starving animal. And your own statistics support 53% of females don't even breed. What's wrong with this picture?
Yeah, I'll just say that. So the only thing I'll say on it is that females with cubs are protected in the spring. So if a hunter sees a female with a cub, they're not ethically or legally allowed to shoot it. Me personally, I'm a hunter. I wouldn't, if I knew if it was a female with cubs, I wouldn't shoot it. But I can't. Lots of things go into decision making that aren't ethics or science, and it's the only really. Yeah. Yeah.
So-called traditional medicine.
Yeah.
So that that doesn't need that dog doesn't.
Yeah. I can't speak for other folks, but myself, I'm not a big fan of harvesting females with cubs at any time. So yeah.
Following up on that, what is the likelihood of those bear cubs surviving mother shot?
In the spring, 0. If a cub is orphaned in the spring, I'd say there's very, very little chance they would ever survive. In the fall, there's probably a better chance, but still, they still hibernate with the mom that winter, and so that's indicative just biologically that there's some importance there for them to continue to do that. And so, the only other thing is cubs and yearling bears are always susceptible. They die at high rates. Their survival is quite low in general, depending, much lower than adults. And so, there is that one component of it, but low chances of survival for sure.
So given that, and given the fact that you mentioned that 53% won't even get a chance to breed, the spring bear hunt was stopped for several years. What's the rationale of bringing it back and continuing?
Repeat the question.
Oh yeah, sorry. So the question was, what's the spring hunt was canceled? It was canceled in 1999. So what's the rationale behind supporting it? There's a document that I started writing in 2017 here, so I wasn't around when that decision was being made. And there was a document produced that talked, I think, some about it, mostly socioeconomic. I think there were northern communities, particularly that relied on outfitting, that wanted more opportunity from a socioeconomic perspective. I think the main influence was socioeconomic. And I think that's primarily what drove it. Some of what this project was initiated for was to answer the question of whether that would impact populations. The timing didn't work out that great. What we're seeing now is, there are areas that that the spring hunt possibly could have impacted, that there's those areas that have high harvest in general, fall and spring. And there's areas that can sustain it. There's areas that can sustain more hunting actually than there is currently. There like, you know, those southern areas, those areas are highly productive and could probably sustain more hunting. There's some areas that probably can't sustain, or definitely can't sustain that level of pressure that there is now, and continue to have the same number of bears on the landscape. So yeah. Yep.
But just wondering whether anyone has been able to predict what the carrying capacity would be if there were no hunting, how that might compare with the managed situation.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. So the question was whether anyone has tried to predict the carrying capacity of bears without hunting. So there's some research done so my predecessor Marty Obard did some work in northern Ontario in the Chapleau Crown Game Preserve in the 90s, and that area was not is a Crown Game Preserve. There was very limited hunting in there. Those bears were very likely close to carrying capacity just based on sort of what their reproduction was and that. And I don't know, they were close to maybe 50 bears per 100 square kilometers. So there has been some work done that could inform that. In Ontario, it's tricky because it's such a big province, right? Like it's so varied. I don't know that you could even necessarily extrapolate that to other areas. And so that's probably, yes, so we're quite below that in most areas. That's not all hunting though. Lots of that is habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, other sources of human caused mortality, so human bear conflict, roadkill, those sorts of things. So yeah, but definitely these harvested populations are much below what they could sustain naturally. Yeah.
Are you seeing, or do you have any concerns about what the spread of beech bark disease is going to do as beech bark or beech tree mortality increases?
Yeah.
And with the potential loss of a major mast tree species that would provide the nutrition to black bears.
Yeah. So the question was if there was any concern around beech bark disease and the impact that could have on removing a very important mast species for black bears. And so we don't know, like, you know, the one thing is that where there's beech, there's lots of other masting species. And so, you know, there is on average, it may not be that bad. It's going to be the years where beech would have been the dominant thing, right? So if there's an acorn failure, if there was other food failures, but beech would have been there, you know, like with all that redundancy there, it's better for populations if there's something around. And so you remove one thing from there, you know, and there's lots of other tree diseases that are out there now that are impacting masting species. And so I think there will be impacts to black bear populations. It's a hard one to get a handle on though, just because, yeah, where beech bark disease is hitting is highly variable, and those populations in the south are quite productive as it is, and they're also pretty heavily harvested. And so, like to your question, they're probably quite below carrying capacity. So it may be difficult to know. I think it's not good though. It certainly isn't going to be a good thing for bears as more of these pathogens impact the species that they rely on. Yeah. Yep.
How do you distinguish between human caused mortality with the black bears in comparison with, like, for example, which is purely the hunting versus this other human-based mortality versus their natural death rates, and how does that inform your decision on if the carrying capacity, like in terms of like the hunting, is like the hunting happening?
So yeah. So the question was how do you compare human caused mortality and hunting mortality to their natural mortality, and can use that to understand if harvest rates are too high. So Ontario, we haven't done this sort of work in Ontario, but other places like Minnesota and Michigan have looked at black bear mortality rates and causes. And in those jurisdictions, almost 100% of the mortality is from hunting. There's very little natural mortality because bears are hunted so heavily. Probably many places of Ontario are very similar to that. We don't know exactly. Most of the very detailed research has been from places like the Chapleau Crown Game Preserve, where there's no hunting, Algonquin Provincial Park, where there's no hunting, but those bears actually are harvested quite heavily outside the park. There's probably very little natural mortality in most black bear populations that have any harvest across North America. So it's a bit challenging to know sort of what their natural mortality rates would be. The best we can do is, you know, and what we're doing here is monitoring population numbers over time. And so if those numbers go up or go down or stay the same, that can tell us about what our harvest mortality is doing. So if we start to see populations doing this, we're probably harvesting too heavily. If populations are stable, then we feel pretty good about what the harvest rates are. If they're going up, then they could probably sustain more harvest as it is. So yeah, that's how we try to understand those sorts of processes.
Have you found our harvest rates are too high?
In some places they probably are, again, because it's so big. And let me see if just go back to this slide. And sorry, the follow-up question was, have we found that harvest rates are too high? In these areas, harvest probably that are circled here, harvest plus other sources of human mortality have probably been too high. And so, this area close to Thunder Bay, lots of access, lots more access for hunters, also lots of conflict mortality, lots of traffic, roadkill, those sorts of things. Again, down here, close to Sault Ste. Marie and Sudbury, the same sorts of things going on. But those areas, like just the pure numbers of black bears, are low enough that we can be pretty confident that harvest plus other mortality has been too high in those areas. Yeah.
One last question would be, the data that you're showing, like, it's basically 5 years old at best, you know?
Yeah.
Do you find, like, that seems odd to me. Number two is there any, whenever there's a socioeconomic impact, it seems that the funding and, the people who are making the decisions, they don't like data, so I'm just looking, it seems like a smoking gun to me.
Yeah, so the one thing I'll just say, question was, the data are 5 years old now. So, that seemed odd. And then I'll try to summarize the other one was that, the decision makers don't like data. And I wasn't quite sure on the last one, but decision makers don't like to see this sort of data. So yeah, so one thing here, so these results are 2017 through 2022. So some of the results are just a couple of years old, but what we've done and what we've implemented in the province, let me just move to a map that doesn't have those things in front of it. So what we've done in the province now is that you see each one of these management zones. So these are groups of wildlife management units. We're now on a rotating basis where we go back and we do all of this work again every year in 3 of these units across our zones across the province. So, 2 years ago, I think we did 31 again, which is the area around Algonquin, or not 31, but the number there says 31. That's the number of bears. But the area around Algonquin Provincial Park, we resampled this area here, and I believe we resampled this area here. And the plan will be going forward, similar to how we do moose surveys. Every single year, we'll do one of those units or one of those zones together to try to see what the black bear population is doing going forward. Is it going up? Is it going down? If we find a way, if we restrict harvest in some way, does that relate to increases or decreases or stability in the population? And so just, in terms of this zone or this unit here, or zone, sorry, here, numbers actually were up a little bit when we resampled that. It was originally sampled in 2018 and then in 2023. And in some of these other areas, I think here also came back up a little bit. So going forward, we'll continue to sample, and the plan will be going forward that all of these areas will be resampled over time eventually, so that we can continue to monitor whether that population is going up or going down. And then just in terms of what decision makers like, I can't really speak to it. Yeah, I'm not a decision maker. I only just to say that, this information and the decision to go back to resample these areas regularly to understand what's going on with the population, it was made with the idea of trying to ensure that the population or that the harvest is sustainable, and that if things look really bad, to try to take some action to try to limit bad things happening to bear populations from harvest. I'll just show a quick video if you want to see it of a bear, a very big bear at that same one there.
How many pounds is that?
Probably close to 300, I think. It's a little hard to say, but yeah, it's in the spring, so they're not that heavy, but I bet in the fall he's 300 or more. And then it's really interesting here. Eventually he gets kind of mad. You can see he's sort of, interesting sort of posture there, and then he comes back. I think he was a little worried about going over the barbed wire. These bears are harvested often over bait, or they're hunted over bait, and so I think they're, in a lot of places, they're wary of human scent. And so that's probably what he was doing, and then he eventually did go in. I don't know if, yeah, you can see he's inside there now. And yeah, I wouldn't want to run into him. Anyway. Thanks very much, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I really appreciate that. This is excellent. Thanks.
Well, thanks everyone for coming, and hope to see you on the trails or next month.